Millionaire despises delivery girl, but discovers her talent and falls in love with her. She was just a delivery girl, racing against time, weaving through city streets with takeout bags in hand and a dream long buried beneath bills and survival. He was a millionaire CEO, used to polished boardrooms, high stakes deals, and people who never dared to challenge him. Their worlds were never meant to collide until one elevator ride changed everything. What began as a clash of wills soon unraveled into a journey neither of them could have foreseen. This is the story of how underestimating the wrong woman became the best mistake of his life. Enjoy the story. The wind sliced through the New York avenues with the kind of indifference only winter could bring. Isla Rivera, cheeks flushed from the cold, pushed forward on her worn-down bicycle, the insulated delivery bag strapped tightly against her back. The red light turned green just in time, and she darted between cabs, her fingers numb on the brakes, mind racing faster than her tires. The app on her phone buzzed again. Final delivery. Smith Tower, Fifth Ave. Just one more run, one more ride before she could go home, take off her soaked shoes, and breathe. But life, she had learned, rarely cared for plans. When Isla rolled up to Smith Tower, she craned her neck up toward the steel and glass cutting into the sky. It wasn't her first delivery here, but today, something felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the growing weight of dreams deferred too long. Maybe it was just hunger. She pressed the elevator button, hugging her bag as if it could shield her from what waited upstairs. The doors opened, and a flurry of suits rushed in, too busy with their million-dollar deals to notice the girl in sneakers standing among them. She squeezed into the back, hugging the corner. Just as the doors began to close, one last man stepped in. He didn't rush. He didn't apologize. He simply walked in like he owned the building, because he did. Nathaniel Maddox, co-founder of Brooks and Langston, legal titan, deal maker, and one of the youngest billionaires in Manhattan, adjusted the cuff of his tailored coat and nodded curtly to the others. His presence shifted the air. Not loud, not arrogant, just still. Controlled. Cold. Then came the beep. Overweight. Someone muttered. One of the associates glanced around and pointed. Someone has to step out. Nathaniel didn't move. Isla's eyes narrowed. You were the last one in, she said evenly, arms crossed. So? The entire elevator froze. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued rather than offended. Excuse me? Elevator etiquette, she said. Last in, first out. A few chuckles. Someone murmured, She's got a point. But he didn't budge. I have a meeting on the 38th floor. Isla didn't flinch. And I have a deadline on the 38th floor. You're not the only one with places to be. It was audacious. Foolish, maybe. But she had spent the last 3 years delivering food to skyscrapers filled with people who never saw her, never heard her voice, never even looked up from their desks. And for once, she wasn't about to shrink herself down. Nathaniel looked at her as if she were a riddle. The silence was broken when a junior associate sighed and stepped out. Let's just get this over with. The doors closed. Nobody said a word until the elevator dinged at the top. Nathaniel stepped out, but not before glancing at Isla. There was no arrogance in his expression, just amusement. As if he hadn't expected to be challenged. As if somehow she had shifted something small inside him. Isla sighed and walked toward the reception desk, to deliver her order. But when she read the name of the recipient, her stomach sank. Nathaniel Maddox. Of course. She stood in front of his office, contemplating just turning around and leaving the food with reception. But pride nudged her forward. She knocked once and stepped in. He looked up from a document and did a double take. You. Isla gave him a tight smile. Guess the universe thinks we need a rematch. He leaned back in his chair. Or it just has a sense of humor. She walked in, set the delivery on his desk with careful precision, and turned to leave. But before she could reach the door, he said something unexpected. You argued well. She turned, puzzled. In the elevator? He nodded. You were calm, direct. You didn't let anyone intimidate you. She raised a brow. Thanks, I guess? Nathaniel opened a drawer and pulled out a legal case file. Let me ask you something. If a contract includes a termination clause that leaves the penalty open to interpretation, what's the first red flag? Isla hesitated. It wasn't a game she wanted to play. But then again, when had life given her a chance to play any game on her own terms? If the language isn't specific, she said slowly, then it gives one party too much power. Ambiguity breeds conflict. That clause could be twisted depending on who holds the leverage. Nathaniel studied her. Law school? 2 years at NYU, she said quietly. Had to drop out. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, as if that explained everything. I have a proposal, he said. She blinked. What kind of proposal? Come to the office tomorrow. Shadow me. 1 week. No promises, no titles. Just observation and challenges. I want to see what you do if given a real seat at the table. Isla laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're offering me a tryout after I called you out in a packed elevator? I'm offering you a chance, he said. Take it or leave it. She looked at him, at the skyline beyond the window, at the paper-strewn desk of a man who had everything. And she wondered what the hell she had to lose. All right, she said, but don't expect me to fetch your coffee. He smiled, just a flicker. I wouldn't dare. As she walked out of his office, Isla Rivera didn't know what waited on the other side of this absurd detour in her life. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her. A beginning, and it had started in an elevator. The morning air in New York was crisp, sharp, with the scent of roasted street cart coffee and ambition. Isla Rivera stood just outside the glass entrance of Brooks and Langston, her fingers tightening slightly around the leather strap of her bag. The reflection in the glass doors stared back at her. Navy blue receptionist blouse, neatly pressed black pants, and the calmest expression she could muster despite the storm in her chest. This wasn't just a new job. It felt like a threshold, and if she crossed it, she had no intention of going back. Inside, the receptionist, one who hadn't spared her a glance the day she delivered Thai noodles, now looked up with a small nod. You're here to see Mr. Maddox. Isla nodded, her voice even. Yes, he's expecting me. The receptionist lifted the phone, murmured a few words, and gestured toward the elevator. Top floor. He's ready. The doors closed around Isla with a low hum, lifting her up again, this time without lawyers or confrontations. Just silence. She caught her reflection in the brushed metal of the elevator walls and exhaled. She didn't know if what Nathaniel had seen in her yesterday was real talent or just a passing curiosity. But she wasn't about to let that be the end of the story. When the doors opened, the same polished marble and sleek wood greeted her. And there he was, Nathaniel Maddox, standing near his office window, the city behind him, looking like a watercolor painting. The sun was just high enough to bathe the room in a golden hue, casting soft lines across his features. He didn't turn at first, as if he knew it was her without needing confirmation. "You're early," he said, still watching the horizon. "I figured if I got lost, I'd have time to find my way." That made him smile faintly. He turned, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Let's see what we can do today." Isla sat, resting her hands on her knees. She didn't fidget. She didn't apologize. She simply met his gaze with quiet strength. He handed her a thick folder. "Our client wants to expand into new territory, but their supplier has a tight grip on exclusivity rights. The language in the contract is murky, and they're worried about liability." She flipped open the file, her eyes scanning the dense text. The words didn't overwhelm her. Instead, they intrigued her. The way the clauses were structured, some bold, some hidden in subtle phrasing, felt almost like a conversation between two parties who didn't trust each other. She started marking sections in the margins, murmuring occasional thoughts out loud. Clause 8.2 contradicts 5.1 if this goes to arbitration. The termination terms are conditional, but there's no timeline attached to performance benchmarks. That's going to cause issues. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You didn't go to law school, did you?" Isla glanced up. "No." "And yet you read contracts like you've done it for years." She offered a small shrug. "I read fast, and I remember what matters." There was no arrogance in her tone, just honesty, like it wasn't a gift, but a necessity born from years of figuring things out without help. Nathaniel tapped a pen against the desk, thoughtful. "There's a meeting this afternoon with the client. I want you in the room." "Why?" Isla asked, not to challenge him, but to understand. "Because you saw something I missed. That matters." She hesitated. "I'm not sure people in that room will appreciate taking advice from a delivery girl." He didn't blink. "Then don't give advice. Ask good questions. That's harder anyway." The rest of the morning passed with quiet intensity. Isla followed Nathaniel from office to office, watching how he operated, not just the way he spoke, but how he listened. How he left silence hanging just long enough to make others fill it with things they hadn't intended to say. She was learning more in hours than she had in months, working dead-end jobs that demanded nothing but obedience. But she also noticed the eyes, the sideways glances from other attorneys, the faint, forced smiles. She didn't belong to them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. In the cafeteria, as she poured a coffee, a hushed voice floated from behind her. "She's just a pet project." Nathaniel's voice came in low, too close to her ear. "And some of my best projects have shaken the ground." Isla turned to find him behind her, a coffee in his hand, no trace of apology on his face. "They're not used to change," he said. "You don't have to impress them." "I'm not here for them," she replied. His eyes held hers. "Good." By 3 o'clock, they sat at a sleek conference table across from the client, a composed woman in her 50s, with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper mind. Isla remained silent as Nathaniel walked through proposed amendments, the flow of the conversation steady and practiced. But at one point, the client frowned. "I'm still not clear on how this protects us if they decide to walk away in 6 months. Nathaniel turned slightly, his voice calm. Isla, would you mind explaining what you saw in Clause 9? The room shifted. All eyes landed on her. Isla inhaled, then leaned forward. The clause says the supplier must provide adequate performance for the term of the agreement, but doesn't define what adequate means. That opens the door for them to argue that their interpretation was met, even if it wasn't. She didn't stumble. She didn't shrink. The client studied her, then nodded. Smart. As they left the meeting, Nathaniel didn't say anything at first, just walked beside her in silence, hands in his pockets. You weren't nervous, he said eventually. I was terrified, she replied. But it didn't matter. He stopped then, turning to her. You have more potential than most of the people in that room. She didn't smile. She just nodded. Then let's not waste it. That night, as she walked home under the weight of a folder still clutched in her hand, Isla knew something had shifted, not just in her life, but in her sense of herself. She wasn't playing a role anymore. She was stepping into it. The days that followed moved quickly, but for Isla Rivera, every minute inside Brooks and Langston felt like walking through a corridor lined with both opportunity and quiet resistance. Her desk, though modest, sat just outside Nathaniel Maddox's office, an intentional placement, he claimed, to keep communication efficient. But Isla knew it was more than that. It was also a statement. To the others in the firm, her presence was both a curiosity and a challenge. Her first official assignment came early Monday morning. A contract dispute involving a healthcare startup and a pharmaceutical supplier had escalated, and the firm needed to craft a solution before things reached arbitration. Nathaniel handed Isla the file without ceremony. You'll prepare the first draft of our counter proposal, he said, and I want your reasoning annotated. If we're going to push back on this, we need to be airtight. Isla nodded, though her fingers trembled slightly when she took the folder. It wasn't the task that intimidated her. It was the responsibility behind it. A mistake wouldn't just cost credibility. It could cost the firm a $1 million client. She worked through lunch, skipped breaks, and by early afternoon had covered the file in notes, both digital and handwritten. Her mind moved quickly, assembling and disassembling arguments like puzzle pieces until they finally fit. As she typed the last few lines of her proposal, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Still here? It was Lena, Nathaniel's longtime secretary, and perhaps the only person in the office who treated Isla like she belonged. Most new assistants are still getting coffee orders right now. Isla looked up, offering a tight smile. I like starting strong. Lena chuckled, setting a cup on her desk. Good. You'll need that fire. Later that day, Nathaniel called her in. He didn't say much when she handed him the document, just raised an eyebrow and gestured for her to sit as he read. The silence stretched long enough for Isla's thoughts to turn traitorous. Had she missed something? Was her tone too informal? But then he looked up. Clause 12. You rewrote the liability provision? I did, she said evenly. The original language left room for the supplier to argue shared fault. I tightened it to reflect clear breach conditions. Nathaniel nodded slowly, a rare spark of admiration behind his eyes. Smart. Risk-averse, but assertive. I like it. A rare swell of pride lifted in Isla's chest, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she asked, Does it pass? He leaned back in his chair. It does. In fact, I want you to present it to the team tomorrow. She blinked. Me? Yes. You wrote it. You understand it better than anyone else. That's what matters. The next morning, Isla stood at the head of a conference table flanked by senior attorneys, their expressions varying from curiosity to quiet dismissal. Hyder Monroe, a litigation partner known for his cutthroat demeanor, stared at her with folded arms. He didn't say a word, but his skepticism hung in the air like smoke. Isla didn't falter. She explained each revision she'd made, walking through the structure of the proposed agreement, identifying risks, and offering alternatives for the most vulnerable sections. When she finished, the room was still. Hyder finally spoke. So you're telling us that a clause rewritten by a delivery girl is now what we're putting in front of $1 million client? The words stung, but Isla didn't react. She only lifted her chin. No, I'm telling you that a clause rewritten by someone who took the time to understand every part of this contract is what's going in front of the client. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then I suggest we go clause by clause and compare our work. There was a pause, brief but heavy. Nathaniel, seated at the far end of the table, broke it with a calm, satisfied tone. Let's move forward with Isla's draft. Meeting adjourned. As everyone filed out, some silent, others mumbling, Isla remained still, her hands resting on the table. She felt every pair of eyes that had tried to burn holes through her, but she also felt something stronger beneath it, a foundation being built, not just for her work, but for her place there. Nathaniel lingered as the room emptied. You didn't just hold your ground, he said. You owned it. She shrugged. They don't have to like me. I just want them to read the contract and know it's solid. He studied her a moment longer, then smiled slightly. They will. And eventually, they'll respect where it came from. Back at her desk, Isla caught her reflection in the glass of a nearby frame. The woman staring back looked almost the same as she had a week ago. Same clothes, same quiet intensity. But something had shifted. Not on the outside, but inside. She wasn't just holding a place anymore. She was earning it, one clause, one meeting, one challenge at a time. The week that followed unfolded with a strange, electric tension. Isla could feel it in every glance that lingered too long, every abrupt pause in hallway conversations when she walked by. Word of her performance in the meeting had traveled fast, and while Nathaniel had made it clear she was not just a temporary novelty, not everyone shared his conviction. Especially Hyder Monroe, whose pride had clearly taken a hit. Despite the undercurrents, Isla focused harder than ever. She was determined to earn every ounce of the respect she'd begun to command, even if it came slowly. One morning, Nathaniel handed her another challenge. This time, a pending negotiation with a large energy client whose contract renewal had stalled due to complicated liability clauses. The case wasn't just intricate. It was politically sensitive within the firm. If it went sideways, it could mean reputational risk, not just financial. I want you to prepare our initial strategy, Nathaniel said, sliding the thick folder across his desk. The client will be here on Friday. You'll brief me before then. Understood, Isla said, taking the file with steady hands. But her heart beat faster. This wasn't just about contracts anymore. It was about trust. For the next 2 days, she immersed herself in the documents, cross-referencing previous versions, researching similar disputes, and analyzing precedent. She stayed late in the office, her desk glowing under the quiet hum of a desk lamp long after most employees had gone home. One evening, Nathaniel stopped by her workspace. "You're still here," he said softly. She looked up, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "This contract's a labyrinth. I want to be sure we don't walk into it blind." He leaned against the edge of her desk, arms folded. "You do know I have associates who can take this on." "I'm aware," Isla replied. "But you gave it to me." Nathaniel didn't speak for a moment. He watched her in silence, his gaze unreadable. Then he nodded once and walked away, leaving her with a strange warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the case. By Thursday, Isla had crafted a strategic outline that addressed every pain point the client had flagged. She prepared mock objections, responses, and fallback options. When she presented it to Nathaniel, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he tapped the table lightly. "This is excellent work," he said. "You've thought 2 steps ahead, which is exactly what we need." A flicker of pride lit her features, but she tamped it down. "Thank you. I'll have it ready for tomorrow's meeting." The next day, the energy client's team arrived, flanked by their legal counsel. Isla stood behind Nathaniel at the table, silent at first, taking notes and listening. But when the conversation reached a sticking point, the liability clause again, Nathaniel turned to her. "Isla, could you walk us through the proposed adjustment?" All eyes turned to her. For a split second, the old fear tugged at her. But then she stood, took a breath, and spoke clearly. She explained how the revised clause mitigated risk without exposing the client to unfair penalties. She cited case examples and pointed to comparative agreements from similar industries. She didn't speak as a junior assistant. She spoke as a strategist. And when she finished, the lead counsel from the client's side looked impressed. "That's a compelling solution," he said. "Frankly, clearer than what we've heard from most of our own team." Nathaniel smiled, just slightly. That's why she's here. The meeting ended with smiles and handshakes. The client agreed to proceed with the renewal under the adjusted terms, pending final review. Back in Nathaniel's office, Isla placed the updated notes on his desk. "You handled that flawlessly," he said. "I've learned from the best," she replied. There was a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, just charged. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, watching her. "You don't let anything scare you for long, do you?" he asked. "I'm used to starting at the bottom," Isla said. "Fear can't afford to stay." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "There's something rare about the way you work. You don't just absorb information. You build from it. You don't follow rules. You interpret them. That's not just smart. That's powerful." Isla looked away for a second, caught off guard by the intimacy in his tone. She had come here for a job, a chance. She hadn't expected this level of attention, of recognition, especially not from someone like him. She cleared her throat, retreating behind professionalism. "I'll prepare the follow-up documents for signature." But as she walked out, her thoughts remained tangled. Because something had shifted. Not just in the way others saw her, but in how she and Nathaniel were beginning to see each other. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. That weekend, Isla found herself sitting in the small cafe near her apartment, the same place where she used to rest in between delivery runs just months ago. The contrast between then and now felt surreal. She stared out the window at the bustle of the city, her laptop open, files scattered across the table. But her thoughts wandered. Since stepping into the firm, her world had changed rapidly, almost too rapidly. And in the eye of that storm stood Nathaniel Blake. She thought about the moment in his office after the successful client meeting, the way he had looked at her, the unspoken energy in the room. It wasn't just professional pride anymore. Something deeper lingered between them, something uncharted and slightly dangerous. Isla had built her life on boundaries, on keeping emotions in check. But Nathaniel was making that nearly impossible. On Monday morning, Isla returned to the office determined to shut out the noise in her mind and focus. There was a lot to do, and distractions, especially emotional ones, were a luxury she couldn't afford. But as soon as she stepped into the building, she knew something was off. The atmosphere had shifted. Lena, the firm's senior secretary and someone Isla had grown to trust, approached her with a folded note. "You should see this," she whispered. Isla took the note and unfolded it. It was anonymous, typed, and unsettling. It accused her of falsifying her resume to gain employment at the firm, questioning her credentials and ethics. Isla read it twice before speaking. "Where did this come from?" "It was left in Barnes's inbox," Lena said grimly. Barnes, the firm's senior managing partner, held significant power. A whisper in his ear could change everything. Isla folded the note calmly, though her fingers trembled. "I see." Nathaniel wasn't in yet. She knew she couldn't wait for him. She had to face this on her own terms. She headed straight to Barnes's office. The older man looked up from his desk as she entered. "Miss Quinn, I received a note that someone filed a complaint about my hiring," Isla said, her voice firm but respectful. "I wanted to address it directly." Barnes regarded her for a long moment. "You're aware this firm has a strict hiring process." "I'm very aware. That's why I brought my academic records, letters of recommendation, and the official documentation from my previous law school enrollment." She placed the folder on his desk. "I dropped out due to financial hardship, but my record is clean, and every word on my resume is verifiable." Barnes opened the folder and examined the contents. Isla remained standing, resisting the urge to fidget. After several minutes of silence, he looked up again. "This is in order," he said, tapping the folder. "And frankly, your recent contributions have been difficult to ignore." "Thank you," Isla replied, her voice steady but carrying an edge of controlled emotion. "But I'd also like to know who's behind the accusation." Barnes's expression tightened. "We're looking into it, but I suggest you stay focused. People don't try to sabotage nobodies." As she stepped out of the office, a mix of relief and frustration swelled in her chest. It didn't take a genius to know where the attack had likely come from. Hyder Monroe. The rivalry had gone from subtle to strategic. By the time Nathaniel returned that afternoon, Isla was back at her desk, calmly reviewing documents. But he noticed the tension in her jaw immediately. "You spoke to Barnes?" he asked. She nodded without looking up. "Handled it." He watched her closely. "You're not alone in this." Isla finally met his eyes. "I know, but I needed to stand up for myself. If I run to you every time they come after me, I won't survive here." Nathaniel leaned forward. "I don't want you to run to me. I want you to know that someone in this place will always have your back." Her breath caught for a second before she responded. Thank you. That evening, as Isla packed up her things, Lena stopped by again. You've got more support than you think, she said softly, and people are starting to notice the difference you're making. Isla gave a small smile. Then I just have to make sure I give them something worth noticing. She walked home that night with her head high and her heart still slightly heavy. The attack had been personal. It stung, but it also reminded her that she was no longer invisible. She was being seen, evaluated, and, perhaps more importantly, feared. And yet, beneath the weight of it all, something else quietly bloomed. Not just pride, not just resilience, but something warmer, more dangerous, something that grew in every shared glance across a boardroom table and every conversation that lingered too long after hours. She knew she couldn't ignore it much longer, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. The days that followed unfolded like a game of quiet warfare. Isla moved through the halls of Blake and Partners with the poise of someone who understood the battlefield was no longer just about legal documents, but perception. How people saw her, whispered about her, doubted or defended her. She had proven herself once, twice, maybe more, but for some, that was never enough. And for others, especially those like Hyder Monroe, it was simply too much. By midweek, Isla was pulled into a high-stakes contract negotiation with a foreign investment firm, Arcos International, whose complex merger deal required not only legal precision, but emotional intelligence. Nathaniel had chosen her specifically to assist on this one. And it wasn't just about her sharpness anymore. It was about the trust he was placing in her, even when the firm's inner circle still harbored reservations. Their client, Arcos, was wary. The negotiations had been dragging for months due to unresolved clauses related to long-term liability and exit rights. The previous associates on the case hadn't been able to find common ground. Isla knew the only way through was to listen more than speak. She spent her nights combing through the documents, identifying not just the legal gaps, but the human fears behind them. What the client wasn't saying. She prepared a proposal and walked into the next meeting like a soldier heading into battle. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, flanked by two senior partners. Across the sleek mahogany table were three representatives from Arcos, stone-faced and skeptical. Isla stood when it was her time. She spoke calmly, not rushing, her voice clear and measured. What's holding this deal back isn't the numbers, she began. It's fear. Fear of entrapment. Fear of risk. We can't erase those, but we can address them. Then she presented a revised clause, innovative yet legally sound, allowing for phased investment, a structured buyout period, and clear contingencies for unexpected downturns. She anticipated their doubts and answered them before they had to ask. By the end of her presentation, one of the Arcos representatives, a graying man with a harsh frown, leaned back and said, "This is the first time this contract feels like something I could sign." Nathaniel didn't say a word until the meeting ended, but when Isla stepped into the hallway, he followed. "You didn't just salvage that deal," he said. "You transformed it." She shrugged, trying to play it cool, but her pulse betrayed her. "I just listened. That's all most clients want." Nathaniel tilted his head, eyes lingering on her face. "No, Isla, that's not all you did, and you know it." She looked away, suddenly conscious of how close he was standing. The air between them was no longer neutral. It hadn't been for some time. Well, I hope it's enough to quiet the critics. It's not about quieting them, he said, his voice softer. It's about making them irrelevant. Later that afternoon, Lena found Isla back at her desk, rereading the Arcos contract as if something had gone wrong. You should be celebrating, Lena said, sliding a coffee onto her desk. The partners are talking, in a good way. Isla smiled faintly. I know. It's just, every time I succeed, it feels like the stakes get higher. That's because they do, Lena said. But that's how you climb, one impossible expectation at a time. That evening, Isla was the last to leave. The office was empty, city lights flickering through the tall glass windows. She stood by one of them, gazing out over Manhattan. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of a door. She didn't have to turn around. She knew it was him. Nathaniel stepped beside her, both of them staring out at the same skyline. You should go home, he said, his voice quieter now. I will, she replied. I just needed a second. They stood in silence for a long time. Isla, he said finally, I've tried to stay professional, to respect the line we never talked about but both feel. She didn't move, didn't look at him, but her heart began to race. But you should know, he continued, that line is getting harder and harder to see. She turned to face him then, the city lights casting shadows across his features. Why are you telling me this now? Because the longer I pretend it's not there, the more I lose the chance to say something real. There was a long pause between them, tender, charged, unsure. I came here to change my life, Isla whispered, not to complicate it. Nathaniel took a breath. Maybe the two go hand in hand. He didn't ask for anything more, didn't step closer. He just let the moment exist between them. And when he finally turned to leave, Isla remained by the window, her reflection staring back at her. In her eyes, there was strength. There was fear. But above all, there was something new. Possibility. The following week arrived with a sense of pressure Isla hadn't quite expected. Word of the failed complaint had circulated quietly, but its implications lingered like a scent no one wanted to name. Some colleagues avoided eye contact altogether. Others became oddly courteous, suddenly remembering to thank her or offering lukewarm compliments about her work. It wasn't hard to see through it. What they feared wasn't just her presence now. It was what it represented. Change. Unpredictability. A threat to the established order. Nathaniel, on the other hand, seemed more composed than ever. In the days following the confrontation with Clive, he hadn't mentioned the complaint again. But something unspoken had changed between them. It wasn't just mutual respect anymore. There was a new rhythm to their interactions, a softer current running underneath the professional exchanges, as if their every conversation was the preface to something deeper. On Tuesday morning, a surprise came through Isla's inbox. Nathaniel had assigned her to lead a key client negotiation, one that involved a long-standing partner of the firm, Anderson Holdings. This wasn't just a big case. It was one of the firm's most politically sensitive accounts. The stakes were high, the margins razor-thin, and the client notoriously difficult. Being entrusted with it sent a message to everyone watching. Isla Hartley was no longer just the girl who argued in elevators. The day of the meeting, Isla dressed with careful deliberation. Her outfit was sharp but unpretentious, just like the impression she intended to leave. When she walked into the conference room, Mr. Richard Anderson was already there, seated with his team, flipping through the draft proposal. He glanced up, eyebrows raised. "You're leading this?" "I am," Isla said calmly, taking her seat. "I've reviewed the proposal and the concerns you expressed in your previous correspondence. I'd like to walk through the changes we made and address any remaining questions." To his credit, Anderson didn't scoff or protest. He gestured for her to proceed. Isla walked him through each clause, line by line, her tone crisp but steady. She anticipated objections, countered with clarity, and offered alternatives that balanced the firm's interests with Anderson's notoriously high expectations. Halfway through, Nathaniel entered the room quietly and took a seat beside her, but she didn't look at him. She stayed focused, unwavering. By the time they reached the end of the proposal, something had shifted in the room. Anderson leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "You're sharper than most people I deal with, and I don't say that often." "Appreciated," Isla replied. "Shall we proceed with the next steps?" He gave a small smile. "Let's." After the meeting, as the room cleared, Nathaniel lingered behind. "You didn't just handle that," he said. "You led it." Isla exhaled slowly, the adrenaline beginning to taper off. It felt good. "You've earned their respect." "Some of it," she corrected. "Let's not pretend they're all converts." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Not yet. But they're watching. And the more they watch, the more they'll realize you're not going anywhere." She nodded, her gaze momentarily drifting to the city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "That's the plan." There was a pause. The air between them seemed fuller than usual. "You know," he added, voice lower now, "when I brought you on, I expected pushback. I even expected a few bumps. But what I didn't expect was how quickly you'd prove everyone wrong. Even you." Nathaniel smiled, faint but genuine. "Especially me." Something in his voice pulled her attention back to him. The silence stretched, not awkward, but weighty. Isla felt the familiar war between her instincts and the quiet pull of something more personal, more vulnerable. "I'm not sure what to do with any of this," she admitted finally. "With what?" "This connection. Whatever it is we're dancing around." Nathaniel took a step closer. Careful, but deliberate. "You don't have to do anything. We're both grown-ups, Isla. We can choose." She met his gaze, steady and sure. "And if I'm not ready to choose yet, then we wait. No pressure, just honesty." For a moment, the weight in her chest loosened. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a decision. But it was enough. Enough to know the space between them wasn't just imagined. Later that week, as they walked out of another successful meeting, Isla caught a glimpse of Haley from legal, whispering to another associate. She knew the whispers wouldn't stop. Not yet. But she also knew something else now. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. What mattered was the work, the progress, and the ground she was slowly but surely claiming as her own. When she returned to her desk that afternoon, she found a sticky note stuck to her monitor. Nathaniel's handwriting, neat and direct. "Next week, client gala. You're on the guest list. Wear something that makes them remember your name." She smiled, tucking the note in her drawer. Something told her that gala wasn't just going to be about business. And she was ready. The night of the gala, arrived faster than Isla anticipated. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the deep navy gown that hugged her figure just enough to feel elegant, but not too much to feel like someone else. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun, was styled in loose waves that brushed her shoulders. A part of her still questioned whether she belonged at an event like this, whether the girl who used to rush through city streets with takeout bags had truly earned her place among high-profile clients and multi-million-dollar conversations. But she had come too far to doubt it now. When Isla entered the ballroom, the space shimmered with golden lights and the kind of laughter that masked calculation. Men in tailored suits stood in tight circles, discussing market shifts, while women with perfect posture floated from table to table. It was a different world, and yet somehow she walked into it with quiet confidence. Nathaniel spotted her almost immediately. He was speaking to a client near the stage, but the moment his eyes found her across the room, his words seemed to falter. He excused himself gently and made his way toward her, weaving through the crowd with a focus that made her breath catch. "You clean up well," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I try," she replied, offering a half smile. His gaze lingered, not inappropriately, but with an intensity that said he saw more than just the dress. "Tonight's going to be interesting." "What makes you say that?" "Because you're here, and they're not used to seeing someone like you walk in and take attention without asking for it. They'll get used to it," she said. "That's what I'm counting on." Throughout the evening, Nathaniel introduced Isla to several key figures: board members, investors, and long-standing partners of the firm. Some offered her polite smiles, clearly unsure how to address her presence. Others, to her surprise, were genuinely warm, curious about the woman who had not only held her own, but raised the bar for everyone else in the office. With each conversation, Isla's unease softened. She wasn't here by accident. She had earned every second of this. Later in the evening, during a quieter moment near the edge of the room, she stepped out onto the balcony to catch her breath. The city stretched before her like a canvas of lights and movement. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cool night air brushing against her skin, and tried to absorb everything. "You always find the quiet corners." Nathaniel's voice came from behind her. She didn't turn, but she smiled. "Sometimes they're the only places where I can hear myself think." He joined her, resting his hands on the balcony railing beside her. "You were impressive tonight." "It was just conversation." "No, it was presence. You walked in there and shifted the room without trying. That's something you can't teach." She looked at him then, really looked at him, not as her boss, not as a man offering opportunities, but as someone who saw her, and not just the polished version she presented to the world. He saw the woman who fought for every inch she had gained. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Why give me a chance when it would have been easier not to?" He turned toward her, expression soft. "Because I saw something in you. From the first moment. You challenged me when no one else dared. You spoke like your opinion mattered, even when the world told you it didn't. I've spent years surrounded by people who perform. But you, Isla, you believe in what you do. That kind of fire doesn't fade. It only grows." She looked down, absorbing the weight of his words. A long silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the gravity of things left unsaid. "I'm not just here to impress people at galas," she said finally. "I know," he said. "You're here to change the rules." Their eyes met, and something in her chest stirred, something deep and unfamiliar. For the first time, it wasn't just about ambition or proving her worth. It was about belonging, about being seen in a way she hadn't thought possible. Before she could respond, the music inside swelled again, and the doors behind them opened. A colleague called Nathaniel's name, signaling that he was expected at the podium for a speech. He gave Isla a reluctant smile. "Duty calls." She nodded. "Go charm the room." "I'll try," he said, "but I doubt I'll find anything more captivating than this moment." Then he disappeared back inside, leaving Isla standing under the stars with her heart thudding in her chest. Later, as Nathaniel addressed the crowd, his speech, while laced with the expected professionalism, carried something more personal in its tone. He spoke about transformation, about courage in unexpected places, and about the value of voices that come from outside the traditional mold. Though he never mentioned her name, Isla knew, and more than that, everyone in the room knew too. That night, as the gala wound down and she slipped away from the ballroom, Isla felt different, not changed, but revealed. Like the version of herself she had always fought to protect had finally stepped into the light, and the world hadn't just accepted her, it had admired her. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore, but knowing she had it made all the difference. The days following the gala marked a quiet but profound shift between Isla and Nathaniel. Neither of them acknowledged it outright, but something had changed, subtly, undeniably. They still spoke in the same clipped professional tones at work, still passed files across desks and exchanged emails like nothing had ever happened. But the moments between those exchanges had become heavier, charged with unspoken thoughts, with glances that lingered a second too long. Isla was aware of it every time Nathaniel entered the room, and she hated that it made her feel so exposed. She wasn't a woman who lost focus, not for anything. But this was becoming harder to ignore. One crisp morning, as autumn began painting the city in amber and crimson, Isla arrived at the firm to find tension in the air. People whispered in the hallways, voices low, eyes darting. Lena met her at the elevator, concern etched into her expression. "You haven't checked your inbox yet, have you?" Lena asked. "No? Why?" "There's a meeting scheduled for this afternoon. Emergency internal review. It has your name all over it." Isla's chest tightened. She didn't need Lena to explain. This wasn't about contracts or deadlines. It was a setup. She'd seen it coming for weeks. The subtle undermining, the rumors about her qualifications, the way certain colleagues avoided her or spoke in half smiles. She had rattled too many cages, proved too much too quickly. And now, someone wanted her gone. She walked into Nathaniel's office without knocking. He looked up, startled, then immediately set his pen down. "You saw the email," he said. She nodded. "They're coming for me." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "I know. Do you know who's behind it?" "Most likely Everett. Maybe Daniels. They've been uncomfortable with your role since the day I promoted you." "I'm not surprised," Isla said, crossing her arms. "I just need to know, do I stand alone in that room today?" Nathaniel stood, walked around his desk, and faced her squarely. "No, you don't." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it meant everything. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. Isla spent the rest of the day reviewing every project she had touched, compiling notes, printing records of every contract she had improved, every client she had saved. She wasn't walking into that room unarmed. When the time came, she stepped into the boardroom, wearing the same quiet confidence that had carried her from food delivery to the top floor of a corporate skyscraper. Around the long table sat a mixture of curious onlookers and calculating adversaries. Everett sat at the head, flanked by Daniels and two other senior partners. Nathaniel was already seated, his posture calm but alert. Isla took the open seat across from them, laid her folder on the table, and looked directly at Everett. "You requested this meeting. I assume you'll begin." Everett leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "This isn't a trial, Miss Hartley. It's a review. Some concerns have been raised about the nature of your hiring, your background, and whether your continued position here reflects the firm's professional standards. And by some concerns, you mean your concerns," Isla said evenly. Everett's expression flickered. "Several of us have questions." Nathaniel spoke, his voice cool. "Let's be clear. Isla was hired because she demonstrated exceptional insight, capability, and legal reasoning. She's saved this firm hundreds of thousands in potential losses in just under a year. And yet," Daniels interjected, "she lacks the formal accreditation expected of our associates." "I never claimed to be an associate," Isla said. "I was hired in a unique role, and I've exceeded the scope of that role consistently." Everett narrowed his eyes. "And yet, your influence over contracts and client negotiations has been unusual for someone without a degree." That was the moment Isla had been waiting for. She opened her folder and began laying out documents, case summaries, contracts she had flagged for risk, clauses she had redrafted, client testimonies, even internal memos commending her work. "For every file here," she said, "there's a measurable gain for the firm. Risk reduced, clients retained, outcomes improved. I didn't ask for special treatment. I was given a chance, and I made more of it than anyone expected." Daniels flipped through one of the documents, his brow furrowing. "Furthermore," Isla continued, "I've enrolled in night courses. I've been preparing to take the bar. My lack of certification isn't permanent, but what I do have, what you can't measure on a diploma, is judgment, tenacity, and a record of actual results." The room fell quiet. Everett looked at Nathaniel. "Is this the kind of precedent you're comfortable with? Hiring someone off the street because she's clever?" Nathaniel leaned forward. "No. I hired her because she's better than most people with 10 years' experience. Because I'd rather have someone who's lived in the real world and fought their way in here than another entitled graduate with no fire." Isla's breath caught. It was the first time he had defended her that openly. Daniel sat back, sighing. "I've reviewed her work. It's undeniable. She's made this firm stronger." Everett still looked unsatisfied, but the momentum had shifted. "We'll revisit this in the next performance cycle," Everett muttered. Nathaniel shook his head. "No, we won't. This was your chance. You took it, and you lost." As the meeting adjourned, Isla gathered her documents slowly. Her hands were steady, her head held high. Outside, as the rest of the staff dispersed, Nathaniel caught up to her. "You didn't just survive that," he said. "You owned it." She turned to him. "I'm tired of just surviving. I want to build something here, for real." His eyes softened. "Then let's build it. Together." And for the first time, Isla allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't just another stop along the way. Maybe it was becoming home. The weeks after the boardroom confrontation passed in a flurry of quiet victories. Isla found herself working with a new sense of clarity, no longer tiptoeing around tension or second-guessing her place in the firm. Her name carried weight now. Colleagues who once watched her with skepticism began consulting her before finalizing drafts. Junior staff started seeking her guidance. And although not everyone welcomed the change, no one could deny the shift that had taken place. Isla Hartley was no longer just the girl from the elevator. She had become a force. But alongside the professional growth, something deeper had been blooming in the spaces between deadlines and late-night reviews. Her connection with Nathaniel no longer felt like a thread fraying at the edges. It had become something strong, unspoken, yet ever-present. They hadn't talked about that night after the board meeting, but the energy between them had changed. It showed in the way he looked at her during meetings, the way his voice softened slightly when they were alone, the way he trusted her more than anyone else on his team. One Friday evening, as the office emptied out, Isla was still at her desk, reviewing a complicated clause in a high-profile merger contract. The city lights spilled through the tall windows, painting the room in gold and quiet. She didn't hear him approach until he gently placed a coffee beside her elbow. "You're still here?" Nathaniel said softly. Isla glanced up, surprised, then smiled. "So are you." He leaned against the edge of her desk, watching her. "Do you remember what I said that first day in the elevator?" She nodded slowly. "That I had guts." "No," he said with a quiet laugh. "I mean after that, when I tested you." "You said I had potential," she replied, meeting his eyes. "That I was rare." He gave a small nod. "I did. And you've proved it again and again." "Me." She set her pen down and folded her hands. "Why are you really here, Nathaniel?" He hesitated. Then, as if something inside him gave way, he said, "Because I can't stop thinking about what we're becoming, about what you mean to me, not just as part of the firm, but as a person." Isla's breath caught. She had prepared herself for many things: another test, a compliment, a new challenge, but not this. "I've spent most of my life building walls," he continued. "This firm, this image. I didn't think there was room for someone to walk in and make it all feel different." She stood, her eyes not leaving his. "You were never just my boss to me, Nathaniel. You challenged me, yes, but you also saw me when no one else did. That mattered more than you could possibly know." He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I don't want to keep pretending that what's between us is just professionalism. I know the risks, but I also know what I feel." Isla searched his face, her heart thudding in her chest. "So what now?" Nathaniel smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "We stop running from it. We figure it out, together." The quiet that followed was not awkward, not uncertain. It was full of understanding. Isla stepped closer, and without another word, he leaned in and kissed her. Not hurried or hesitant, but with the weight of months of tension dissolving into something tender and true. Afterward, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I'd find this here," she whispered. "Neither did I," he replied, holding her a little tighter. The months that followed were filled with delicate balancing acts. They kept their relationship private at first, not out of fear, but out of respect. For the work, for each other, for everything they had built. But it wasn't long before people began to notice. Lena was the first to confront Isla about it, cornering her in the break room with a grin too wide to ignore. You know, for someone so composed, you're not great at hiding feelings, Lena teased. Isla rolled her eyes, but the flush in her cheeks betrayed her. When the news became public, it was met with mixed reactions. Some whispered, some raised eyebrows, but none of it mattered. The work spoke for itself. Isla continued to shine, now promoted to a senior role with her name on major accounts. Nathaniel, too, had never looked more confident, as if allowing himself to love had opened up a new version of him, softer, more human. Then one snowy evening, Nathaniel asked her to meet him at the firm's rooftop garden, a space usually reserved for formal events and summer galas. When Isla arrived, wrapped in a navy coat, the city glittering below them, she found him standing beside a small table, 2 glasses of wine, and a single candle flickering in the cold air. "Okay," she said, smiling as she approached. "This is either a thank you for closing the Peterson deal, or you're about to do something dramatic." Nathaniel stepped toward her and reached into his coat pocket. "You've changed everything for me, Isla. You walked into my life when I least expected it, and somehow, without asking for anything, gave me everything." Her eyes widened as he dropped to one knee and held up a small velvet box. "I want to build something with you, not just in this firm, not just in our careers, but in life. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Isla's eyes, and for once, she was speechless. She nodded, laughed, then finally found her voice. "Yes." Nathaniel stood, slipping the ring onto her finger, before pulling her into an embrace that made the world disappear. In that moment, everything that had ever seemed impossible now felt inevitable. From the elevator that nearly left her behind, to the office battles, the whispered doubts, the endless proving of herself, every step had led to this. Not a fairy tale, not a fantasy, but something real, something earned, something hers. And as snow fell gently around them, Isla Hartley finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the best stories were the ones you never saw coming. From the very first moment Isla Hartley pedaled through the bustling streets of the city, balancing takeout bags and the weight of survival, she was already more than the world gave her credit for. Her story began as a delivery girl, overlooked, underestimated, dismissed by those who couldn't see past her uniform. And yet, it was within those seemingly ordinary moments, arguing with a CEO in a crowded elevator, refusing to step back when others told her to, that the extraordinary in her began to rise. Isla never intended to make headlines. She didn't chase attention or accolades. All she ever wanted was a fair chance to be seen, to be heard, and to prove that her mind was just as sharp as her resilience. What followed was not just a professional evolution, but a personal journey into strength, identity, and love. The woman who once rushed against time to deliver food would, through sheer courage and wit, end up drafting contracts for multi-million-dollar firms, solving disputes that seasoned attorneys couldn't, and standing toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful people in the legal world. But her growth wasn't without opposition. Isla faced skepticism, jealousy, and overt hostility from colleagues like Martin Chase, people who believed their credentials entitled them to success, while hers made her an imposter. Yet each time she was cornered, Isla chose intellect over ego, preparation over panic, and grace over revenge. With every challenge she overcame, she redefined what it meant to earn respect, not because of a title, but because of undeniable results. Her relationship With Nathaniel Royce, the once distant and controlled CEO of Royce and Hartley, added another layer of complexity to her journey. What started as a reluctant interaction bloomed into mutual admiration and eventually into love. Not the rushed kind driven by passion alone, but the enduring type rooted in shared values, trust, and vulnerability. Their bond was built slowly in the quiet moments of teamwork, in the trust passed through unspoken glances, and in the willingness to protect one another's integrity, even when it cost them comfort. Nathaniel, for all his wealth and power, had lived a life in calculated lines, rarely coloring outside of them. But Isla drew light into his world. Her unpredictability, her fire, her unshakable ethics challenged him to be more than just a leader. She inspired him to be human. In turn, he gave her the platform she had always deserved, not as a favor, but as a recognition of talent. Together, they didn't just find romance. They discovered a partnership where intellect met instinct and love met respect. The culmination of their journey, a rooftop proposal in the winter glow of the city skyline, wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where love wasn't a distraction, but a source of strength. A chapter where Isla could stand fully in who she was, flawed, bold, brilliant, and be embraced not despite it, but because of it. So what is the deeper lesson in Isla Hartley's story? It's this: never let where you start define where you can go. In a world that often judges people based on their title, income, or background, Isla's journey is a powerful reminder that talent, heart, and integrity matter far more. It reminds us that opportunities are not always handed to the most privileged, but they can be claimed boldly and unapologetically by those who dare to step forward when everyone expects them to shrink. Her story teaches us that setbacks don't disqualify us, they prepare us. That criticism, if handled with clarity and purpose, can become the very fire that forges us into something greater. And perhaps most importantly, Isla's path reminds us that the strongest kind of success is the kind that lifts others as it rises. In our own lives, whether we're pushing through difficult jobs, navigating unfair perceptions, or trying to prove ourselves in spaces that weren't built for us, we can look to Isla's resilience and find strength. We can speak up when others want us silent. We can work harder, think deeper, and show up fully, even when it's uncomfortable. And we can do all of this without losing ourselves in the process. To everyone watching this, remember, you are not the labels others place on you. You are the story you choose to write. Whether you're just beginning or feel stuck in the middle, keep writing. Keep showing up. And don't be afraid to surprise the world with what you're capable of. If Isla Hartley could go from overlooked delivery girl to legal powerhouse and partner in life and law, what's stopping you from stepping into your own next chapter? Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If you found this story inspiring, meaningful, or empowering, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing more heartfelt, transformative stories that speak to real struggles and real triumphs. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and stay tuned for our next story. Because someone out there, maybe even you, is about to become the next unexpected hero. See you in the next video.